note about THO and the direction of this new year. We are excited as an organization to increase the focus and analysis on the transatlantic alliance. So what better way to kick it off than a panel with these great experts on the importance of NATO, the future of NATO, and much more. And with that, I'm going to do very brief bios of the speakers. If I were to list all of their accomplishments, we'd be here all day, quite frankly. So please, continue to reference their bios online and their experiences to get the full image. But I will go ahead and begin with brief bios and then turn it over to the speakers for our questions and then move on to the Q&A portion before we close out today. So first up, we have Ambassador Tajan Ildem. Ambassador Ildem has served in NATO as Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy since 2016 and directs NATO's Public Diplomacy Division. As a senior Turkish diplomat, Ambassador Ildem served as permanent representative of Turkey to the OSCE in Vienna, Director General for International Security Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Ankara, and also served as Turkey's permanent representative to NATO. So Ambassador Ildem, thank you so much for joining us today. Next, we have Ambassador Susan Elliott. Ambassador Susan Elliott has been the president and CEO of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy since 2018. She also served as civilian deputy and foreign policy advisor to the commander of the United States European Command and has held various positions in the U.S. Department of State, including U.S. Ambassador to Tajikistan and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs. So, Ambassador Susan Elliott, thank you so much for joining us as well. And last but not least, of course, we have Dean Stephen Mariano of the NATO Defense College. He has served as the Dean of the NATO Defense College since 2019. He was Associate Dean of Outreach and Research and a professor at the United States National Defense University's National War College, while previously serving as a professor at the U.S. Military Academy and at the Royal Military College of Canada. His military service includes military advisor to NATO Senior Civilian Representative in Kabul, First Director of Strategic Plans and Policies and Assessments for the U.S. Army Southern European Task Force in Italy. So Dean Mariano, thank you so much for joining us today. Now, audience members, we have a lot to get through, so I will go ahead. Panelists, you can go ahead and unmute yourself. And Ambassador Ildem, I know you wanted to share a few remarks before we get started. So first, we want to ask you, of course, from your experiences, from your analysis as well, in this change in administration with President Joe Biden, what changes do you expect to see in NATO in the coming year from this change, both in terms of policies and goals, and also any introductory remarks that you would like to make?
Well, first of all, I would like to thank Turkish Heritage Organization for inviting me to join this distinguished panel for our discussion today. At the outset, I would like to highlight the importance of the report that we, the experts group, prepared, NATO 2030, United for a New Era. And I have to emphasize that we were not representing our individual countries, but rather making a contribution as independent experts. And when the Secretary General commissioned such work, he highlighted the importance to keep our alliance strong militarily, and also to make it politically stronger, and also for NATO to take a more broader global approach. And I must tell that the 10 individuals who took part in the deliberations and finally prepared and presented the report had to deal with a number of existing and potential threats and challenges that NATO faces. And we came up with 138 recommendations. Some of them important, maybe some of them not that important, but we thought it would be useful to share those ideas. And to add to the weight of the report, I have to remind the audience that it is a consensual document. So 10 experts agreed on every word of the document. It is now up to the Secretary General as part of the reflection process. We contributed with this report, but Secretary General is still consulting with different segments of the society, first and foremost, youth representatives, and I attach also great importance to the voice of young leaders. Since you referred to the new administration in the United States, yesterday the Secretary General and President had a call which we read on news, and it's good that President Biden reaffirmed the commitment of the United States to NATO, specifically referring to Article 5. We all know the background information regarding the past statements. Sometimes Article 5 reference was not so much highlighted in those statements. So it is an important reassurance for all allies to see this strong commitment from the United States. Also, we know that there will be a summit meeting in Brussels later this year. So those recommendations that we presented to the Secretary General and which foreign ministers deliberated on in December at their meeting can also provide a good input for Secretary General to come up with a set of recommendations. What we tried to do was to come up with practical and plausible recommendations, because we might have come with two revolutionary ideas, but we know that after all it is the political will of individual allies whether to adopt these recommendations or not. But in any case, it is exciting to see that NATO, as the most successful alliance in history, is trying its best to adapt itself to the new evolving security environment. And one of the important recommendations that we came up was for NATO to update its strategic concept, which dates back to 2010. And I think there are so many changes which the new concept requires to capture and also give guidance, strategic guidance for the future. Our work has been future oriented by nature, so we were looking to the future, but not backwards. So in a nutshell, this is as part of introductory remark what I could say. Since we are still in the beginning of the new year, I would like to express my best wishes to the distinguished panelists and you yourself and all participants. My best wishes for a healthy and happy new year.
Thank you, certainly. And I can't believe we're already in 2021. And with that, so much to look forward to within foreign policy and all the changes within NATO as well. And Ambassador Yildirim, I want to emphasize a point that you said there with the NATO working group there, with the 10 members agreeing on every single word in that report. I think that's a quite unheard of a situation these days in our hyper partisanship and continued polarized world. So we're excited to focus on the path forward in the future of NATO in that sense. So thank you for sharing that. Now, Ambassador Elliott, I want to turn to you. You've held numerous positions and roles within the State Department and within government. So from your experience and just in difficulty to play the guessing game of what's ahead, what do you feel though may be the U.S. Greatest foreign policy concern regarding NATO and the future of NATO? And will there be any sort of policy shift towards NATO within the new Biden administration?
Well, thanks, Savannah, for inviting me to be part of this program and to be part of a great distinguished panel. First, I'd like to kind of reiterate some of the things that Ambassador Ildem said and thank him for being part of the reflection group. I think that this report, NATO 2030, United for a New Era, is extremely important. And as he mentioned, it's clear there was a lot of thought and hard work that went into this report. And I very much appreciate the work that you did. And I would second what Savannah said. The idea that you got agreement among, 10 different members is also quite an accomplishment. But one of the things that I think that the report highlights is that, the importance of having NATO, that it's not just a military alliance, but it's a political alliance. And we can certainly talk more about that, in our discussion. But I think that's an extremely important thing to point out. And also that, NATO needs to address not just the security challenges and the security of the Euro-Atlantic region, but also the global challenges which we're all facing now. Things like climate change, things like the pandemic. I think these are extremely important, and I think for NATO to continue to be as important as an alliance as it has been, those things need to be part of the dialogue among the allies. So for that, I want to, thank you very much. And it doesn't mean that you've abandoned the traditional Euro-Atlantic security, but that you are at least recognizing that we have to look at more challenges for the future. And again, I don't speak for the administration, I'm retired, but I will say, as the ambassador mentioned, I was very pleased to see that President Biden talked to Secretary General Stoltenberg yesterday. And I think that, you've probably all seen the readout of the call, but I think, in terms of the question, I think President Biden made clear his intention to work and consult with the allies on a full range of issues. Including, Afghanistan, Iraq, Russia, China. So I think that's an extremely important, sign for all of us that, the president did reaffirm the United States commitment, as the ambassador mentioned, to the Article 5 of NATO. I think that's extremely important. And as, everyone on the panel and in the audience knows, the only time that Article 5 was invoked was when the U.S. was attacked on 9/11. So I think it's an extremely important thing that the president reaffirmed his commitment to that article. But I think the other thing that I think is what has made NATO such a strong and important alliance, and President Biden pointed this out in what I read on the readout of the call, is that the importance of our shared values. What to me makes our alliance important is not necessarily military threats, but the importance of being like-minded democracies and working together, not only to strengthen deterrence, but also counter, new and emerging threats, and work together as like-minded nations to come up with some kind of collective ideas that we can face. And again, not only just on deterrence and making sure that militarily we're strong, but also in looking at things like global health security, climate change. And one thing, when I was at the U.S. European Command, we began to talk a lot about threats that are non-traditional military threats, like ones from cyberspace or, in space. So I also would point out that, they agreed, and I'm looking forward to have President Biden being, involved in the planning of the NATO summit later this year in Brussels. And I think that what I see for the future is a strong alliance, and that the U.S. being and continuing to be, a strong member of NATO. And as I mentioned, I think over the past few years, we've really kind of focused on, some of the problems that in NATO or, the military alliance. But I think that looking at how we bolster the political dimension of NATO, including its foundations, as I mentioned, on shared democratic principles, mechanisms of consultation, decision-making, and political tools. As the ambassador pointed out, each country is sovereign and they have to make decisions on what kinds of things that they will do. But I'm very optimistic that that President Biden and the new administration will be very engaged in working with NATO to support the issues that that the reflection group highlighted in this report. So I think I'll stop there. But thanks again to the ambassador for being involved in that, what I think is an outstanding report.
Thank you, Ambassador Elliott, and certainly some really key points there that are so positive in focusing on that, as you mentioned, positive political dimension. So we certainly think that conversations like this, of course, the reflection group, and that refocusing and recalibration of NATO will hopefully lead to that increased engagement. Now, Dean Mariano, I want to kind of go a little bit deeper in the trenches here in terms of NATO policy. Obviously, you have a military background. One of the goals that Secretary General Stoltenberg has mentioned for 2021, or at least in the near future in NATO, is addressing NATO's policy on arms control. How do you think that NATO member states will approach this issue of both arms control and nuclear deterrence for the future?
Well, thank you, Savannah, and thanks and congratulations to the Turkish Heritage Organization for putting on this event. It is a pleasure indeed to be here with distinguished colleagues. And Ambassador Yildirim, we missed you at the advisory board this year. We had it last month, so we miss you, but glad to see that you are off doing important work. It's interesting. We can come back to this report, I think, because there's a lot to talk about, including the role of education. And we were happy here at the NATO Defense College to talk about the paragraph that was in there about the importance of education and the possibility of a NATO university in the future. Bold ideas in that report, which we think, a lot of people think, it's just what the Alliance needed to kickstart thinking that had been somewhat dormant in terms of a new strategic concept and a little bit of paralysis that had set into the creative side of the Alliance. So compliments to you, Ambassador Yildirim, and all the members of the report. To the question of the arms control issue, I mean, the bottom line is I think member states will approach the issue positively and collaboratively. And we mentioned, of course, the phone call between President Biden and Secretary Stoltenberg, but there was also a big phone call yesterday or today, which was between President Biden and President Putin, where they agreed to extend the New START. So as an example of the positive things that could be ahead of us, there's just an example. So I think it's generally a positive vibe that's happening right now. But it won't be easy. I mean, there's a lot of things to discuss, and the New START's just one. Eventually, we're going to have to rediscuss the INF treaty situation. The JCPOA with Iran is going to be on the agenda. Open skies is down the road. And those are just the ones we know about. What's on the horizon, maybe in the next 4 years, could be talking about these systems that we don't have international regimes for, like autonomous systems, for example. So there might be some discussion about whether or not we need those kinds of regimes. So I think, generally, I think it's going to be a positive situation in that people are open to discussions. It is a priority inside the Alliance. And of course, we've even got guidance here at the college to focus a bit more on arms control in the curriculum. And one of the reasons I like being the dean here at the college is I get to read a lot of papers and hear a lot of great speakers. And I just read a paper this week by one of the committees that talked about the role of non-state actors in arms control. It's not something anybody really thought about. They didn't talk about fundamental Islamic extremist non-state actors. they talked about private corporations, for example. And after reading the paper, I cannot get SpaceX out of my head and think, going forward, what is going to be the role of a corporation, a company like SpaceX and other non-state actors, we call them, in future arms control regimes, when we see so much of the technological development doesn't happen inside the government anymore. It happens outside in the private sector. So there's really some exciting work to be done in this area. So hopefully that helps answer the question a little bit.
Certainly, and you make a really important note that I myself would be guilty of in thinking of non-state actors in kind of one pivot and one possibility. And really, there's so many options and opportunities to incorporate, as you mentioned, you have SpaceX and other organizations and companies to be included in that conversation. So fascinating to see that focus, especially from your work, from your organization, your university. Ambassador Ildem, as we're discussing more of this reflection group and the report, you being directly involved, I'm curious because for some of our audience members, they may not have seen the report just yet, or maybe they haven't gotten through it all the way. So give us the Spark Notes version, the short version of what you think is going to be sort of that crucial or most important initiative that was suggested or discussed in this report that our audience can take away and kind of focusing in on for NATO 2030 and NATO in the future.
Well, first of all, we have to recall that since 2014, with the illegal and illegitimate annexation of Crimea and aggressive actions that Russian Federation had taken in eastern Ukraine, created a new security environment. And NATO had its adaptation efforts in a very systematic way since then, with strengthening deterrence and defense of the alliance, with a number of measures. And when we embarked upon preparing our report, our main task was to look at ways to strengthen the political dimension of NATO, because what we had seen in the past was that NATO already put in place a number of measures for military adaptation. Perhaps in the political sphere, certain steps were lagging. And that's why we focused on political role of NATO, the existing tools that it has, cohesion, unity and solidarity among allies, and consultation and decision-making at NATO. And one important issue is that if we recall ourselves why this exercise was initiated, perhaps time had come already, but there were also certain statements coming from various leaders, like the brain dead of NATO. And I think what we came up with this solid report with 67 pages is some sort of a strong response to such qualifications as brain dead, because what the audience could read from the report is that it testifies to an alliance which is still alive and kicking, and it is a relevant alliance able to adapt itself to new security environment. And I already mentioned strategic concept, but when we look to existing and emerging threats and challenges, of course, one could expect that Russia will remain as a major threat militarily, and we can only hope that Russia could change its posture and abide by international rules and norms, so that NATO could respond to positive developments. So basically on Russia, the dual-track approach will remain valid. No return to business as usual, but at the same time, while strengthening deterrence and defense, at the same time, to be able to maintain meaningful dialogue with Russia is important, with a view to reducing risks and also to promote transparency. One important chapter in our report is China. Although China does not pose a military threat right now, we can see China as a growing power, economically, but also militarily. And China is becoming an important actor in different geographies. So we can see Chinese presence from the north to the south. And we certainly approach it from a prism of challenges, but also opportunities. And in a systemic rivalry or great power competition, we need to be cognizant of what China is trying to do. And we recommend that NATO should be able to discuss more China to see the security implications of this growing power, but at the same time be open-minded to dialogue with China. So it deals with both challenges and opportunities insofar as China is concerned. The fourth important element is emerging and disruptive technologies. And it again offers opportunities, but also pose a set of challenges. And we recommend that NATO should do everything possible to make sure that NATO maintains the technological edge. And it requires more cooperation among allies with different stakeholders, not only government, but also private sector, academia should be in the picture. And innovation should be in the heart of the work of NATO. And this is something that NATO has already done. And there is an innovation board in the structure of NATO. And they are focusing more and more on what could be done and what kind of cooperation that should exist among allies. Now, terrorism was reaffirmed by heads of state and government in 2019 London Declaration as one of the threats that NATO faces. It is an imminent and asymmetric threat, and we recognize terrorism with all its forms and manifestations as a threat to be aware of and to take necessary measures. And in that respect, we may tell ourselves that it is first and foremost national governments to do what is needed in fight against terrorism. But NATO can do more by integrating its activities to three core functions of the alliance. Because there is a tendency, there has been a tendency so far to keep it as a sort of topic for cooperation with partners to strengthen their capacities so that they can fight terrorism. But it's more than that. It relates to other two important core functions, core tasks of NATO: collective defense and crisis management. And as Ambassador Elliott rightly mentioned, it was the first time that NATO invoked Article 5 after a terrorist attack. 9/11 still is in our memories, a very tragic one. And my country, Turkey, suffered the most out of terrorism. So we have a particular sensitivity when it comes to responsibilities and capacities of NATO and solidarity that should exist among allies in fight against terrorism. Arms control is something that you refer to, and I agree that NATO, while supporting arms control initiatives, can also play a forum of consultations. We know that the instruments for arms control are going through a stress test, and more consultations would be required among allies in dealing with specificities of these arms control regimes. So more consultations, using NATO more as a forum, but at the same time to have an effective nuclear deterrence. This is something indispensable, and we have also highlighted it in our report.
Sure.
Challenges.
If I may pause, we will come back to you because I know that there's so much more we could dive into for this report, and I want to just make sure we're keeping an eye on a time. And I do want to put a plug here really quickly for our audience. Make sure you're putting your questions. Go ahead and put them in now in the Q&A function so that we can incorporate them into the conversation. But Ambassador Yildirim, we will be back to you for more on this, as I know that there's so much to uncover, but I want to keep the momentum moving here.
Sure.
Ambassador Elliott, obviously there's a lot that we've discussed thus far, a lot that Ambassador Yildirim has just shared with us in terms of the report of NATO and really this focus of collaboration over competition, the rise of Russia, China, etc. But really the crux of a lot of criticism regarding NATO in international groups, of course in the US as well, is this idea of burden sharing. This is a particular point of contention that was raised, of course, within the Trump administration. Do you think this is something that the Biden administration will continue to hone in on in terms of US demand on increased defense spending amongst other NATO members as well moving forward?
Well, the simple answer to that is yes. But to give you some background, I think, I know the Trump administration has taken credit for an overall boost in allied defense spending in recent years. And I think President Trump's emphasis on that was extremely important. And I think even the Secretary General has praised his efforts. That said, I was in the U.S. government for a long time, and I can remember back to the Clinton administration when I worked for Secretary Madeleine Albright, and this was an issue even then that the U.S. has always raised. But getting the allies to live up to this 2% of GDP commitment is something that really does predate President Trump. And if you look back, just to giving a little bit of history, if you look back to the year 2014, I think what helped stimulate the increased spending was Russia's military intervention in Ukraine. And I think that was sort of, to me, a turning point in helping to get, the allies to realize that, as an alliance where we're pledging to support each other, we all need to make a contribution. And and if you remember, I think that the downward spiral happened after the fall of the Cold War, because I think, in my opinion, many of the allies thought, okay, well, there aren't the kind of threats, and I'm not talking about non-traditional threats, but, the threat from the Soviet Union no longer exists. But if you also remember that President Biden was vice president at that time, so he has a long history of knowing these issues. But, in 2014, just for those of you to remember, at the Wales Summit, all the allies agreed that they would work toward getting to this 2% spending level by 2024. So it's hard to believe, but we're getting close to 2024, and in 2014, I think only 3 of the NATO allies were at the 2%. But since then, we've seen huge progress in getting, having more of the allies hit that 2%. I think at present, if I'm not mistaken, 10. So we of the 30 countries meet that target. And they expect, this year to hit, or have already hit, the 2% of their spending of GDP on the military. So I think that is a really good indication of, I will say, yes, the U.S. has encouraged the allies to spend more, but I also think it's an important, we didn't force people to increase the spending, they did it themselves. And so I think if you just look at from 2014 to the present, at every summit, whether it was Wales, whether it was in Warsaw in 2016 or in 2018 in Brussels, that the allies committed to working toward increasing their spending. Can they do more? Yes, I do think, that we all can do more. But I think in my last assignment, when I was at the U.S. European Command, I saw, that, NATO was probably the strongest that we've, ever seen. They'd never, other than in situations in third countries like in Afghanistan, that the NATO countries really hadn't come together until we had, the enhanced forward presence and the putting together of, NATO troops in the Baltic countries, and then also in Poland and Romania and Bulgaria. So I am actually quite pleased with what I've seen, and I do think that the Biden administration will continue to support that, but I think we need to recognize that the allies have also realized that this is something that we need to do to continue the strength of the alliance. So I probably leave it at that. And I will say, even the other 2 things that the ambassador and the dean brought up, having served in USMC Moscow during the negotiation of the New START treaty, I was very glad that he mentioned, that the Biden administration and President Putin have agreed that this is something we need to continue. But I think that both of the other 2 panelists have pointed out that it's more than just traditional, and I think of arms control, I think of the New START treaty or the INF treaty, but, there are many more things that we, even for the allies who are not nuclear states, but can talk about and look for the future, and especially dealing with, you never really thought about non-state actors as being anything but, a terrorist group, but, including maybe in a positive way, commercial companies, and helping to work on arms control, I think is something we need to explore. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Ambassador. Absolutely great points from everyone here that we have heard thus far. It's been really impressive. I feel like I can't write everything down enough. I'm learning a lot. So I know our audience is likewise, and they're asking great questions in the Q&A. So I want to make sure we have enough time for that. So Dean Mariano, I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we'll be sure to turn to the audience questions here. But we've heard a myriad of different elements that NATO is including, whether it be, of course, the changes in the world that we're facing now with our current threats globally with the coronavirus, of course, but within the report specifically, they discuss the idea of new elements and instruments of state power, like that of cybersecurity, cyber capabilities, and space capabilities. So how can NATO adapt to these more 21st century ideals and weaponry or abilities to enhance their own individual state power and strengthen its capabilities in the near future, and really just better address these 21st century threats?
Thanks again for that question. It is a great question, and it's space and cyber hot topics, particularly space. It became a operational domain for NATO last year, so that's really important. People say, well, why is that important? We were talking about the arms control discussion. It didn't quite say, but when it comes to things like nuclear weapons, not all NATO members have nuclear weapons. So it's important to have the leadership of those nations in NATO that have nuclear weapons to kind of lead in those discussions. And this is a great example where the United States has been so important. But when you apply that logic to cyber and space, it's a little different, because not every NATO nation has robust space capability, but they all have some cyber capability. And so there is some difference there in the way we approach them, I think, but they are a bit sometimes lumped together. One thing that's important about putting space and cyber as domains is it actually allows on the military side a few things to happen. It allows some doctrine to be developed, to think about how to operate in those domains. And something NATO does very well is standardization. It's got a whole organization to talk about standardization of things that allow NATO forces to interoperate. And so by declaring these two domains, space and cyber, it's really helping NATO be able to communicate with one another, establish some standards. And probably the part that's most controversial is by declaring them domains, you can actually start applying some strategic thinking to them in terms of offense and defense, and either observation or monitoring. And it allows you to bring some of principles of strategic thought or warfare or conflict resolution into them as domains. So those are some of the things that are interesting, at least for our discussions here. We know that China and Russia have incredible capabilities in both of these areas. We've seen them, the Russia involvement in the elections 4 years ago in the United States and in other places. We know China over 10 years ago now did some anti-satellite work, blew up one of their own satellites and sent a bunch of debris into space, but they clearly demonstrated they could do it. So we know that as part of this great power competition, that Russia and China are still competing in that way. So it's important for NATO to keep these capabilities, keep abreast of what's going on in those nations, and not just those nations. I would say here in this area too, the commercial industry is super important. And I know at the NATO headquarters, the defense investment team is trying to figure out how to work alongside industry in this regard to keep abreast of the most most recent developments. One of the things just about space and cyber, I saw a report recently, we think a lot about space and how reliant we are on, for example, in this Zoom session right now, it'll be good to know how that signal is traveling from where I am in Rome to where you are in, say, Washington, D.C. A lot of times we think it's all satellite based, but I saw a study recently that said only 6% of the kind of traffic that we're doing now, 6% goes through satellites, and then most of it goes through cables. Some of those are undersea cables. In this case, transatlantic cables. So there's a whole new area out there that people are starting to explore in terms of security concerns when it comes to this nexus of space and cyberspace. And oddly, it's right here on terrestrial Earth, right? It's things like cables and how to secure them, not only underwater, but when they come ashore. Who's responsible for those? And then how's that transition into land? So one of the important things about giving a name to things like cyber and space, and including them alongside the maritime, the land, and the air domains, is it helps military planners and security experts develop a language to think and talk about them and exchange ideas. So I could keep going, but maybe I should just stop there and, as you said, be mindful of time. So hopefully that was helpful.
That was very helpful. I think obviously what we can gather from any of these elements of our conversation is that it is much more nuanced than we may expect, of course. And all of our panelists have done a great job in really breaking this down for us based on policy and experience. We've got about 14 more minutes left with these incredible panelists. So I want to really, fit in as many audience questions as possible. I'll do my best to kind of combine them. So they may not be exactly the phrasing that our panelists, our audience members have addressed to the panelists, but we'll combine them for sake of time. Now, while this conversation, of course, is focusing on NATO, the analysis of the transatlantic alliance, it's difficult to avoid the topic, of course, of the U.S.-Turkey relationship and, of course, the Turkish acquisition of the S-400. So, Ambassador Ilim, I want to start with you here. What implications does the current acquisition of or purchase of the S-400 have on the U.S.-Turkey relationship as it relates to NATO? So how does this impact NATO? One of the audience questions additionally was, how do you assess Turkey's exclusion, therefore, from the F-35 program within the NATO mechanism?
Well, first of all, if I can relate these questions to the very essence of the report itself, we are talking about strengthening cohesion, solidarity among allies, while we try to come up with recommendations for the strengthening of the political role of NATO. Now, I'm sure that when there are assessments regarding the acquisition of S-400s by Turkey, there are some wrong evaluation of the reasons for it. First of all, I personally had taken part in earlier efforts because Turkey's requirement was something of an urgent nature. The threat was real and imminent, emanating from the south. Turkey borders Syria, a country in civil war for so many years, and the villages bordering in the borderline were constantly under missile attacks, and there were so many casualties. And unfortunately, they were not on headlines in the news. So, but we felt the pain of each individual that lost their life. So the requirement was urgent, and we reached out to a number of allies, first and foremost the United States, but the systems offered to us were short of the requirements that we put at the table. Or the systems offered to us were tied to certain conditions which could not be accepted at the time. Therefore, it was a decision made to procure S-400 systems, and I recall the statements of NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg saying that it was a sovereign decision of any allied nation to procure whatever system they wish to. The only important consideration he highlighted was interoperability. And the Turkish officials time and again told that these systems would not be incorporated into a NATO system. So it would remain as a standalone system. Now, since there is also a question on F-35s, and since we are talking about strengthening NATO, and I don't think that excluding Turkey, a strong ally from this program, is a wise decision, because it is detrimental to the interests of NATO as a whole. If we lack certain capabilities to use if needed, then Turkey would be deprived of such a high technology weaponry. And in our report, when you look at the emerging and disruptive technologies part of the report, there is a clear recommendation that in order NATO allies do not go to external sources, there should be more investment for military technology transfer among allies. And this is precisely what Turkey has been advocating. I mean, if Turkey had been given a chance to procure Western systems, I don't think that there would be any need to go outside NATO to a source like Russia. Therefore, as an individual who took part in the preparation of this report, I could only hope that there would be a constructive engagement between Turkey and the United States, two great allies who have invested a lot for promotion of bilateral cooperation and strategic partnership, and to discuss every issue. And we are talking about NATO to provide the unique and essential forum for consultations. And if two allies cannot use means of diplomacy and negotiation, dialogue, consultations, then how could we portray a NATO to outside world? I'm sure that when Turkey was excluded from F-35, when CATSA sanctions were imposed, our rivals, adversaries were jubilating and expressing their happiness that such divergence happening within an alliance. So we should think strategically, and I hope that a constructive engagement on a positive agenda between the two allied countries dealing with S-400s and F-35 issue, and I know that there is a proposal to have a working group also involving NATO in order to make sure that S-400s that Turkey procured would not pose any threat to F-35 system.
Sure.
That would be great. And if I may add also, this could also pave the way to discuss other important issues like terrorism, for instance. And we know that YPG-PYD, not to be qualified as a terrorist organization, although it was acknowledged as extension of PKK by then Defense Secretary Ash Carter during a congressional hearing during Obama administration. There should be a clear understanding, and the two allies should be eyeball to eyeball regarding how to treat terrorist organizations and not to have a treatment to them like strategic partners.
Thank you. And I just want to keep an eye on time. I know that that was a nuanced and storied conversation there that would require probably a whole separate panel to discuss. So I appreciate you working that in. Now, we may have to go just a few minutes over time if our panelists wouldn't mind, because I want to get to some really important questions here. So Dean Mariano, I want to address this question to you because it was briefly mentioned in our conversation today, but one of the audience members discussed what the threat of climate change would be in incorporating this into the work of NATO. This audience member mentioned in the fall of last year, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg focused on climate change, joined an event by NATO UK, NATO Italy, etc. So what work does the Defense College do in this field? And just in general, NATO and climate change, are they going to continue to focus on this agenda as we continue to see that threat increase?
Thanks. That's an excellent question, and one that we've been asking ourselves here for a couple of years. The way, I mean, we have made some attempts to put climate change in the curriculum just as climate change. And honestly, we didn't find it to be that helpful. So what we've done is two things. The first is it's a key and essential part of our NATO 360-degree part of our curriculum, where we look at the North and we look at the high North and we look at issues in the North. Everything from, the Russian remilitarization of its northern coastlines to China's attempt to influence the Arctic Council. And so it's clearly one place where we can, climate change is obviously important as we see it, and we see the Northwest Passage opening up. But we're not a liberal arts school in that way, and so we just don't talk about climate change for the sake of climate change. We look at it from a security implication. And so that's one way we talk about it in the curriculum. The other way we talk about it is human security. So there's a lot of discussion now about the difference between traditional state security or national security and what human security is. And typically that's been focused on the South or in the developing nations. But what the pandemic certainly has brought to us is a new discussion about what security means. And so we do have some lessons and topics and focus on human security. We're actually going to do a faculty development session in 2 weeks on that. We're going to do a miniature scenario seminar on human security that incorporates all those things you might expect, including climate change. So rather than just putting a, one and done, hey, we had a topic on climate change and now we're done and let's move on to something else, we've tried to work on that as a general issue in a couple of places in our curriculum. So hopefully that's helpful.
Certainly. And I think, you bring up a key point there in the idea of redefining what human security is, especially in the threat that we are facing continually today. Now, while we have a few more minutes, Ambassador Elliott, I want to combine a few audience questions here for you. One audience member discusses, and a few have mentioned this overall theme of this power shift in the international system. Obviously, we've seen increased involvement of Russia in a variety of theaters. Obviously, the rise of China is no doubt a threat people will continue to be analyzing. So what will NATO do in terms of reacting to this power shift? And if I may add one more element here, another audience member discussed the idea of the role of non-NATO members and partners. Is there room at the table, so to speak, the proverbial table, for non-NATO members to partner in efforts to combat this power shift or any rising threats in that nature as well?
Well, the one thing I would say, I think this goes back to why I think that NATO alliance is extremely important, and because we're like-minded nations. And if you look, for example, at China, if China is seen as a competitor, a threat, whatever you want to call it, I think if we work together to look at what are the challenges that we face now with the strength of China and the influence of China in the Euro-Atlantic zone? So, and again, I think this makes it a really good topic of discussion for NATO, because the NATO alliance, as I mentioned before, to me is based on that we are countries with like-minded interests, and we need to not be arguing among ourselves on the approach to China, but maybe having this as a forum for discussion on how we deal with Chinese technology, Chinese military growth, whatever the topic is. And rather than making this kind of a bilateral issue, obviously we all have to have our own bilateral relationships with the countries among our alliance and the countries outside. But I think this is an area where we should probably discuss something that traditionally probably hadn't been discussed, always maybe what's the approach to the Soviet Union, what's the approach to Russia, but what is the approach to China and perhaps others. And I see, going back to the other part of your question, I have no problem with engaging countries, like-minded countries who want to be involved in discussions about how we deal with the changing global climate, and I think a real atmosphere of climate. The really good example that Dean Mariano just said is human security. I mean, how do we work together? If you just think of NATO in the military sense, how can all troops come together if we don't have some shared policies on how we prevent the spread of a contagious disease. So I think, and we need to look at more than just the allies on that. So I think that's something that we haven't really seen in this pandemic. And I hope that, we can, especially with the new administration in the US, not only look at how we protect our own people, but how we can work together to face these challenges, among ourselves.
Certainly. Well, Ambassador Elliott, Dean Mariano, Ambassador Ildem, unfortunately, we are out of time. I know that we're going to have many more conversations as it relates to this working group, the report of 2030, of course, NATO in the new year, and much more. I want to thank all of our panelists for incredible analysis. I feel like I was back in school and I learned really quite a lot from all of you and your unique perspectives. So thank you for your time. I want to thank our audience for joining us today. Of course, you can visit this full recording and our future events at www.turkheritage.org. So thank you all so much for your time and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. Thanks, Savannah.